South Korean divisions led the charge, reaching the parallel on October 1st. They kept moving right into North Korea. A week later, American forces were perched at the parallel, anxiously waiting for orders to follow suit. But back in Washington, tough choices had to be made. Should the United Nations continue the drive into North Korean soil? Would this overstep the mandate of a police action? There were no easy answers. U.S. commanders heard rumors that communist China was moving large numbers of troops north into Manchuria. The Chinese resented American intervention in the region and feared that hostilities would spill over into their Manchurian territory. Intelligence reports estimated that up to 450,000 Chinese troops were lurking in the hills beyond the Yalu River, poised to strike. But these warning signs were cast aside by Americans thirsting for an unconditional victory. After the World Wars, anything less would be a disappointment. Korea didn't affect the everyday lives of most Americans as previous wars had. 1950s America was a pleasant, peaceful place where there was a car in every garage and a drive-in diner in every town. Stories of the triumphs in Korea were an exciting diversion from the humdrum every day. And as the Eighth Army marched heroically onto North Korean soil, a bored, communist-hating populace watched with attentive glee. As the fighting moved north, the citizens of South Korea tried to resume their daily lives. Weddings, funerals, and the daily market went on as they had before the war. As they recovered from the destruction of the previous 4 months, they waited anxiously for their leader, Syngman Rhee, to deliver on his long-held promise to unite the peninsula. After centuries of subjugation, the Korean people were anxious to control their own destiny. Whether at the mercy of the Mongols, Chinese, Manchus, Russians, or Japanese, South Koreans were always in the shadow, and often under the command of foreign invaders. They were most influenced by the Chinese, who ruled the peninsula on and off for more than 1,000 years. The cultures of the two countries, each centered around Buddhism and agriculture, were closely linked. But the politics of the two were worlds apart in 1950. South Koreans rejected the Chinese communism that threatened to devour their homeland. Within weeks, their sons would meet their nemesis head-on in the hills of North Korea. There, the front was opening up. The road to Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, was free and clear, and UN battalions raced each other to it. The North Koreans tried to establish a thin defensive line around their capital, but they couldn't curtail the UN momentum. The Eighth Army found itself at the gates of Pyongyang within 10 days of crossing the parallel. Looking at the open road ahead, the men couldn't help being optimistic.
General MacArthur announced that we would be home by Thanksgiving. We believed him. Life seemed good in Pyongyang. Morale was sky high. James Cardinal, Private First Class.
The Eighth Army set out north and west from Pyongyang, eager to vanquish the northern regime. As they crossed the Changchan River, the last major land barrier in North Korea, they could smell victory waiting for them on the other side. But what they found was a mass grave holding over 100 executed American prisoners. The North Koreans were turning even more savage in their desperation. UN resolve was renewed. On October 24th, General MacArthur ordered his men to march straight to the Yalu River. Now he would let nothing stand in the way of total victory. But just over the horizon, squatting silently in the hills, were hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers. On October 25, 1950, the silent fears of the United Nations were confirmed. The Chinese that had been quietly amassing between the UN forces and the Yalu River suddenly made their presence known. In the Central Mountains, thousands of American troops were ambushed and surrounded by a massive Chinese division. Entire battalions were caught off guard and decimated. Airdrops were all the support the UN soldiers had. They fought desperately in all directions, trying to make it out alive. Most of them didn't. As word of the massacre spread among the troops, their morale, which had been sky high just hours before, dropped quickly.
They said it sounded like Chinese. No one knew what the hell was going on. It was Halloween and colder than a witch. We waited and froze. It was very dark. Robert Harper, 19th Infantry.
The Far East Command, already gearing up for a victory parade, still couldn't believe it was facing a full Chinese assault. Reports back to Washington claimed the attacks came from a small force assisting with the defense of the Yalu River, and nothing more. But General Walker was alarmed. He ordered all of his units, even those far from the attack, to pull back to the Changchun River and reevaluate the situation. Then, just as abruptly as the ambushes came, they ended. The Chinese faded back into the hills and waited. Throughout November, American surveillance planes tried to determine just how many Chinese were out there. Estimates counted between 50 and 70,000, a manageable number. But it turned out they missed another 250,000. The Chinese were incredibly adept at concealing themselves. They would keep still all day, camouflaged under helmets covered with brush. To planes flying overhead, heavily occupied areas often looked like empty landscape. Most of November passed quietly, and UN troops held out hope that they'd make it home for Christmas. Assured by the silence, General MacArthur ordered a cautious advance on November 24th. In the west, the 8th Army would head for the Yalu as a unified front, hoping to prevent any single battalion from being caught out on a limb. In the east, the 10th Corps was ordered to make a major advance around the Chosun Reservoir. The first day of the offensive was encouraging. Modest gains were made all along the line. But then, on November 25th, the war suddenly turned upside down. The Chinese found a vulnerable gap between the 8th Army and the 10th Corps in the Central Mountains. They struck there with all their might. The entire UN line was split in two. 3 days into a renewed offensive, the UN force found itself in a full-scale retreat. The UN's lines, as well as its spirits, were broken. And with the attack came the North Korean winter, an enemy that would prove every bit as merciless as the communists. By late November of 1950, United Nations forces were fighting for their lives. The police action that was supposed to produce fast results and total victory had managed to lure opposition from the world's most populous adversary, China. As the front to its west was crumbling, the 10th Corps faced a mounting challenge along the Chosun Reservoir. The Chosun lay high in North Korean mountain country. By late November, the cold there was blistering. The temperature fell as low as 40 below zero, and 50-mile-an-hour winds made it feel even colder. Everything the troops touched turned to ice, engine oil, gun breeches, morphine, and even their own hands and feet. The ground was so frozen that digging a foxhole was out of the question. One pastime to keep the blood flowing was a friendly snowball fight. This was certainly not the ideal place to spend Thanksgiving, but the troops made the best of it.
For Thanksgiving, we were all served turkey and all the things that go with it. You had to eat fast because everything was turning cold. The gravy and then the mashed potatoes froze first. Boy, you ate fast. And all the time, the snipers were shooting at us. William Davis, hospitalman.
Siberian weather and enemy insurgents had taken their toll on the troops. The men had worn the same clothes for weeks, and good meals were few and far between. Troops hardly slept in the sub-zero cold. But in true Marine fashion, they pulled themselves together and prepared to mount an offensive on November 27th. The soldiers were bracing for the worst, having heard the reports of Chinese overwhelming units to the west. The objective was to move around the western side of the Chosun and head north toward Kangye, where the North Korean government was hiding. UN troops were concentrated in 4 positions. The front line lay at Udamni, where Marine regiments were preparing to lead the charge. South of there, 3,000 U.S. Marines were stationed at the base of the reservoir. Down at Koto-ri were 4,200 men, including some Army infantry and British Marines. On the east side of the reservoir stood another 2,500 GIs. Supply lines to these troops were in severe jeopardy, since units below them were already retreating to ports along the coast. But they were ordered to press on alone. To keep the supplies coming, they relied on one of the newest machines of war, the helicopter. Choppers first appeared in World War II, but improvements to their design and stability made them indispensable in Korea, especially during that Arctic winter when ground transport was next to impossible. On the western shore of the Chosin, the Marines crept forward from Udamni and found a solid wall of Chinese waiting for them. Immediately, strategy shifted from offense to defense, and the regiment fell back to the village to brace for an attack. It wasn't long in coming. On November 28, 1950, 6 Chinese divisions descended on Udamni. For 3 days, the battle raged. The Marines unleashed their entire arsenal on the Communists. The Marine Air Wing flew bombing runs from carriers out in the Sea of Japan. But it wasn't enough. The Chinese had them surrounded. If these men were going to make it out alive, they would have to fight every step of the way. Their commander, Oliver P. Smith, offered some famous words of encouragement. "Gentlemen, we are not retreating. We are merely attacking in another direction." Across the Chosun to the east, an even greater disaster was unfolding. The Army 7th Division was cut off on a 4,000-foot plateau, surrounded and vulnerable. Anywhere it turned, it would face a vicious fight. Some soldiers went AWOL, off into the hills or onto the ice of the reservoir, hoping to escape the trap.